Yeah, I'd have to say so. Let me start off by saying that my father was a professional musician, classically.
If Eddie Van Halen ever kept an enemies list, he never gave the world a neat, signed copy of it. There was no final late-life confession where he calmly sat down and named 6 guitarists he hated most. What he did leave behind was far more revealing than that. He left flashes of irritation, moments of wounded pride, a few sharp comments, a few bruised relationships, and a lifelong frustration with what happened after he changed the sound of rock guitar forever. Because that is the real story hidden inside this title. By the time Eddie Van Halen reached his 60s, the mythology around him had become almost as loud as the music itself. Every old interview had been picked apart. Every offhand remark had been turned into a feud. Every disagreement was inflated into hatred. And somewhere along the way, a more dramatic version of Eddie was invented for the internet. Not just the dazzling guitarist who rewired the instrument, but a bitter king sitting on a mountain of amplifiers, glaring down at anyone who dared to borrow one of his ideas. That image is dramatic. It is clickable. It is also too simple, because Eddie's story was never really about hate. It was about ownership, identity, admiration turning awkward, influence becoming imitation, and the strange loneliness that comes when you become so original that the whole world starts sounding a little bit like you. If Eddie's music ever took you back to a certain time in your life, if those opening notes still hit you the way they did the first time, take a second to like the video, subscribe to Star Kingdom, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. Because to understand why Eddie bristled at certain guitarists, you first have to understand what he believed music was supposed to be. He did not think of himself as a circus act. He did not think of himself as a technical athlete. He did not even think of himself as a flashy player, even though millions of fans saw him that way. In later interviews, Eddie made it clear that what mattered to him was feel, emotion, instinct. He wanted guitar playing to make people feel something: joy, danger, excitement, even humor. His pyrotechnics were never supposed to be empty tricks. To him, they were simply the fastest route from his imagination to the speaker cabinet. That mattered because once Van Halen exploded at the end of the 1970s, the world did what the world always does with a revolution. It copied the surface, the tapping, the dive bombs, the striped guitars, the swagger, the harmonics, the speed. And to Eddie, too many players took the outer shell and missed the heart of it. Years later, he said many of the guitarists he influenced had missed his point. They took what they learned from him and made it sterile, too calculated, too typewriter perfect. That is one of the most important statements Eddie ever made about his so-called rivals, because it tells you that the people who truly bothered him were not always the most famous names. Sometimes they were an entire generation. In other words, the first guitarist Eddie may have resented the most was not one guitarist at all. It was the army of imitators that followed him. And for older viewers who lived through that era, you remember exactly what happened. In the late 70s, Eddie sounded like the future arriving early. By the mid-80s, his fingerprints were everywhere. Sunset Strip was full of players with high hair, hot amps, hot rod guitars, and fingers flying up the neck. Technique became currency. Speed became identity. Everybody wanted the spark. Too many settled for the pose. That is where the bitterness in some of Eddie's comments came from. Not from jealousy, not from fear, from disappointment. He had not set out to create 1,000 clones. He had set out to make noise that felt alive. And that brings us to the first real name in this story. The first documented case where Eddie's irritation stopped being abstract and became personal. Rick Derringer. This one cut especially deep because Derringer was not just another player on the scene. He was one of Eddie's heroes, one of the people he grew up on, one of the older names who had already earned his place by the time Van Halen came roaring into the picture. Eddie had learned from players like that. He respected them, which is exactly why it hurt when he felt one of them had started borrowing from him. In a 1979 interview, Eddie complained that Rick Derringer had opened for Van Halen and played what Eddie described as his exact solo. That was not a vague criticism. It was not a fan rumor. It was Eddie saying, in plain language, that someone he admired had crossed a line. The image is almost painfully human. The young star, suddenly famous, watching one of his own heroes step onto a stage and echoes something he felt belonged to him. Eddie later described confronting Derringer directly, not as a detached celebrity, not as a polished media figure, more like a wounded kid who could not believe what he was seeing. The emotion in that story is what matters. It was not just about notes. It was betrayal by proximity. When a stranger copies you, it is annoying. When a hero does it, it lands differently. And that tells you something important about Eddie Van Halen's personality. Underneath all the confidence, all the grin, all the volcanic playing, there was a fiercely protective instinct about his sound. His guitar was not just a tool. It was an extension of himself. He built it, painted it, modified it, defended it. He hated the idea that his identity could be bought, reproduced, or worn like a costume by somebody else. That same 1979 period reveals how sensitive he was about being copied in every form. He was angry at companies cloning his guitar ideas, angry at people using his name, angry that fans might think he was selling out when others were profiting from his image. He even changed the look of his instruments when people started latching onto the old one. That was classic Eddie. If the world caught up, he turned the corner again. So when we talk about the guitarists that he hated, what we are really seeing in the Derringer story is a larger pattern. Eddie was not simply policing originality. He was defending identity. He believed sound had a soul, and if somebody borrowed the shell without earning the spirit behind it, he took it personally. The second name often pulled into this conversation is Tom Scholz of Boston. Now here we need to be careful, because this is where rock mythology gets slippery. Over the years, accounts have circulated claiming Eddie felt Scholz had lifted elements of his style, and one retelling quotes Eddie speaking about Scholz in especially hostile terms, describing him as unsociable and deeply aggravating to deal with. That account has traveled widely enough to become part of the legend. But what makes the Scholz story interesting is not just whether every line survived perfectly through retellings. It is why the story stuck. Boston and Van Halen represented two different kinds of guitar power. Boston was precision, architecture, studio science, layered perfection. Van Halen was danger, motion, personality, and controlled chaos. If you grew up with FM rock in the 70s, you can almost hear the difference in the air. One felt engineered for liftoff. The other felt like it might burst through the wall. So when stories emerged that Eddie resented Scholz, it made emotional sense even before it was pinned down factually. Eddie hated anything that felt cold, over-controlled, or emotionally distant. He wanted electricity in the performance. He wanted a human being in the notes. If he thought somebody was lifting ideas from him while also treating him with reserve or superiority, that would have touched two nerves at once: artistic theft and personal frost. Whether the hostility toward Scholz was as severe as later tellings suggest, the underlying pattern fits Eddie perfectly. He could admire brilliance. He could not stand feeling copied and dismissed at the same time. And then there is Eric Clapton, which is where the story becomes more mature, more complicated, and frankly more moving. Because if Rick Derringer represented anger, Clapton represented heartbreak. Eddie had openly identified Clapton as one of the players he grew up on. Clapton was not just another contemporary. He was part of the foundation, one of the men whose phrasing, tone, and blues feeling had shaped the young Eddie long before Eddie became a household name. You can hear that older lineage in Eddie's own remarks. He knew where he came from. He knew he had absorbed things. He was not pretending he emerged from nowhere. But by the 1980s, the relationship between guitar generations had changed. Eddie was no longer a student in the audience. He was the phenomenon everyone else was reacting to. At one point, Eric Clapton made remarks suggesting that for all Eddie's close listening, he had somehow missed the deeper point of the blues. It was the kind of criticism that goes straight to the bone, not because it insults your speed, not because it mocks your showmanship, but because it questions your understanding, your depth, your soul. And that mattered enormously because Eddie did not see himself as shallow. In fact, one of his biggest complaints about his imitators was that they had taken the feeling out of what he did. So imagine what it must have felt like to hear a hero imply that you, the man who thought everyone else was becoming sterile, had somehow missed the essential emotional center yourself. That is not ordinary rivalry. That is pain. There is no strong evidence that Eddie hated Clapton in some melodramatic, tabloid sense. The reality is sadder and more interesting than that. This was a case of admiration meeting judgment. A younger genius who had once worshipped an older one, then finding himself viewed as a flashy outsider by the very tradition he thought he honored. For mature viewers, that kind of wound probably feels familiar. Sometimes disappointment hurts more than open conflict. Sometimes the person who affects you most is not the one you argue with, but the one you wished had understood you. So if Clapton belongs on a list like this at all, he belongs there not as an enemy, but as one of the few men who could truly get under Eddie's skin without even trying. And once that happened, once the public saw that even heroes and heirs could misunderstand each other, the press and the fans began doing what they always do with great artists. They started building rivalries everywhere. That is how names like Randy Rhoads entered the mythology. For years, rock fans have repeated stories about bad blood between Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads. Some versions paint them as direct opponents fighting for the same throne in the early 80s. Some make it sound as though Eddie dismissed Randy. Others suggest Randy took offense at things Eddie said. And because both men transformed hard rock guitar at nearly the same moment, the rivalry story has always been irresistible. But when you step back from the legend, the facts become less satisfying for gossip and more revealing about the culture around them. The early 80s were hungry for gladiators. One magazine cover, one overheated quote, one half-remembered backstage story, and suddenly the public had a duel. Eddie versus Randy. Technique versus technique. California thunder against English classical precision filtered through Ozzy's darkness. Fans wanted it to be a war, because wars are easier to follow than overlapping brilliance. The truth is that this may say more about the era than about either man. Randy Rhoads was a stunning, disciplined player with a different personality and a different musical, emotional world. Eddie was looser, funnier, more explosive, more rooted in swing and feel. The comparison was inevitable. The hatred is far harder to verify. And that matters because once a myth takes hold, it changes the legacy of everyone involved. Eddie's occasional sharpness became proof of feuds. Randy's seriousness became proof of resentment. Every genius had to be cast as either ally or enemy. In that sense, Randy Rhoads belongs in this story not because Eddie clearly hated him, but because the world desperately wanted Eddie to hate somebody worthy of his level. Randy fit the role. The narrative was too tempting. And Eddie spent much of his career trapped inside narratives that were bigger, harsher, and simpler than the man himself. The same thing happened with Yngwie Malmsteen. If any name symbolized the next generation of technical guitar spectacle, it was Yngwie. Faster, baroque, unapologetically excessive, proudly virtuosic. He was exactly the kind of player lazy storytellers would place opposite Eddie in a fantasy rivalry. Over time, stories circulated suggesting mutual distrust, professional insecurity, or backstage tension. Like so many rock stories, some versions are dramatic enough to spread long before anyone checks where they came from. What is solid, however, is the symbolic meaning of a name like Yngwie in Eddie's story. By then, the world had entered the full age of shred, and Eddie had to watch the culture magnify precisely the aspects of guitar playing he had warned against. The sterile, the calculated, the typewriter perfect. Whether Eddie personally targeted Yngwie in some grand, documented crusade is less certain than the larger truth that the entire shred explosion represented both his triumph and his misfortune. He had opened the door. Then he had to watch people build a theme park around the doorway. That is one of the saddest ironies in Eddie Van Halen's life. He liberated the instrument. Then he became partially trapped by what liberation turned into, which is why one of the strongest hate stories around Eddie was never about a single rival. It was about the culture of mechanical brilliance that followed him. He did not object to talent. He objected to talent with no blood in it. And if you listen carefully to the way he talked, he kept returning to the same values: feel, sound, personality, fingers, the human hand, the human ear. He could joke about gear, but he never truly believed gear was the secret. He could talk about technique, but he did not believe technique was the destination. He wanted the note to mean something. That also explains why some players came away from Eddie not as enemies, but as proof that he could admire greatness when it still felt human. Even in stories where younger guitar heroes approached him in awe, the point was never just speed. Eddie responded to individuality. He did not want a worshiper. He did not want a clone. He wanted a musician. So by now we have to ask the deeper question beneath this whole title. Why has the world been so eager to turn Eddie Van Halen into a man defined by the guitarists he hated? Part of it is simple. Conflict sells. A list of enemies is easier to package than a lifetime of artistic frustration. It is easier to upload, easier to thumbnail, easier to turn into 10 minutes of outrage and reaction. But part of it runs deeper than that. Eddie Van Halen represented an almost impossible standard. He was not just influential. He was disruptive. The kind of musician who splits time into before and after. And whenever somebody does that, people want a story that brings them back down to earth. They want the genius to be insecure, petty, bitter, threatened. It makes the legend feel manageable. Yet Eddie's real vulnerability was not that he was consumed by hate. It was that he cared so much. He cared when people copied him. He cared when heroes disappointed him. He cared when fans misunderstood him. He cared when the soul got drained out of the thing he loved. That is not the profile of a cartoon villain. It is the profile of an artist with thin skin in exactly the places that mattered most. And maybe that should not surprise us. The same sensitivity that lets a player pull impossible feeling out of 6 strings is often the same sensitivity that leaves him exposed. The world heard confidence in Eddie's playing, and it was there. But there was also fragility. You do not spend your life reshaping guitars, hunting tone, changing rigs, changing details, and defending your sound so fiercely unless something in you is always listening for the threat of dilution. For older audiences, this part of Eddie's story may be the most relatable of all. There comes a point in life when you realize success does not protect you from misunderstanding. In some ways, it invites more of it. The better you do something, the more people reduce it. The more famous you become, the easier it is for strangers to tell your story badly. And Eddie Van Halen was told badly for years. Reduced to tapping, reduced to flash, reduced to tricks, reduced to excess, reduced to rivalries, reduced to enemies. The irony is that he spent much of his career arguing against those reductions, often in rough language, sometimes in wounded language, but always with the same basic message. You are not hearing what I meant. That may be the truest line in this entire story. Not here are the 6 men I hated most. Not these are my sworn enemies. Not these are the guitarists I could not stand. The truer line is this. They missed my point. Rick Derringer may have triggered that feeling in one very personal way. Tom Scholz may have represented it in another, colder one. Eric Clapton may have embodied the pain of being judged by a hero. Randy Rhoads and Yngwie Malmsteen became symbols of the rivalry machine built around Eddie's legacy. And the faceless armies of imitators became the final proof that influence can be both flattering and lonely. By the end of his life, Eddie did not need an enemies list to explain himself. The record already existed. The interviews existed. The comments existed. And taken together, they reveal something much more interesting than hatred. They reveal a man who revolutionized his instrument so completely that he spent the rest of his life arguing with the echo. That echo came back to him through copycats, through critics, through heroes, through fans, through the whole distorted hall of mirrors that fame creates. Some reflections made him laugh. Some annoyed him. Some cut him deeply. But none of them erased the original voice. And that is where this story finally lands. Not on the names of 6 hated guitarists. Not on some final act of bitterness. But on the cost of being first. When Eddie Van Halen hit those notes, the world changed. And once the world changed, he had to live in it too. He had to hear his own influence turn into fashion. He had to hear his emotion mistaken for flash. He had to endure the strange fate of every true original, becoming so widely copied that people forget how shocking the original felt. Yet the original is still there, still swinging, still smiling, still dangerous, still human. And that may be the most powerful answer to this title. Eddie Van Halen was not defined by the guitarists he hated. He was defined by the part of him that refused to let the guitar become lifeless, no matter how many others tried to turn it into a formula. If you remember the first time Eddie's playing stopped you in your tracks, share that memory in the comments. And tell me this. Do you think Eddie was misunderstood more than he was bitter? If you enjoyed this documentary, like the video, subscribe to Star Kingdom, and I'll see you in the next one.